So here we are moving from the digestive system onto the circulatory system. And I'm going to come back to this concept of the digestive system again, which is the whole purpose of accessing glucose from our food specifically. And then the circulatory system, it's going to be really, really responsible for moving all of those things around to the various places that it's needed. So we're going to come back a lot to the idea of cellular respiration. I would reinforce that as like the big picture idea of this whole unit. How do these systems contribute to keeping us alive by allowing cellular respiration to happen? So my question here is, why do we need a circulatory system? All of our cells have to be bathed in fluid to allow for diffusion to happen. So even diffusion of gases, they are dissolved first in the fluid surrounding our cells, and then they're able to move in or out of the cells. So diffusion, we talked a little bit in lesson 4 about it. So you can go back and just review that. That's things moving from high to low concentration. Also, to get glucose into cells, it needs to be dissolved in fluid in order to do that. Since we are multicellular and are made of trillions of cells, many of them are never in contact with the outside world. So we need still a way to get glucose and oxygen, as an example, into our cells. So obviously, we have many cells that are internal. They are not actually accessing the air, and nor are they accessing any direct food source. So that brings us to talk about the main functions of circulatory system. First and foremost, needs to deliver oxygen from the lungs to our cells. Again, we need that for cellular respiration, which I've written here yet again. And it also needs to deliver the glucose, which is absorbed in the small intestine, to the other cells of our body. So the circulatory system is just so necessary for that. Also mentioned previously, but it needs to transport our hormones of the endocrine system. So those were those chemicals that are used for communicating between different organs and organ systems. We also need it to transport immune system cells, so such as the white blood cells and so forth that are needed to fight off infections. We also really need the circulatory system for removing waste from our cells. I mentioned CO2 here. We know we exhale CO2, but also for moving around fluid, things in the fluid. So, for example, our kidneys eliminate a lot of urea. They eliminate excess of even minerals that are found in our blood and so forth. So, lots of other byproducts that we don't want really hanging around. If we have excess of them, the circulatory system brings them where they need to go, so our body can release them. So in mammals, which is our focus, because we are also mammals, we have what's called a two-circuit circulatory system. Circuit 1 is the systemic system, and this is blood flowing from the heart to the tissues and then back. So I've mentioned here that I will typically label oxygenated blood as O2 blood, which is written usually in red, and then also deoxygenated blood, which is DO2, which I've written, moves blood from the tissues back to the heart. So that's the systemic, that's going out to the system and back to the heart. The second one is the pulmonary circuit. Pulmonary circuit is going to the lungs from the heart and and vice versa. So I have deoxygenated blood traveling from heart to lungs. That's where it's going to actually pick up oxygen, drop off CO2, and then flow back from the lungs to the heart as oxygenated blood. So that's the reason for all of these pictures. Now, when we talk about the heart, which we're going to do as a whole lesson on its own, we're going to see that in the heart, we're also going to mention this deoxygenated versus oxygenated blood, but it's a circuit. So it's going to go round and round on these two sides. So the oxygenated blood that returns to the heart is then set out into the systemic circuit and so forth. So here we have just a bit of information about blood. You might have talked about blood as a tissue, as a connective tissue in grade 10. And what it means, connective tissue, it's a super general type of tissue, but it's anything suspended in a fluid. So for blood as an example, it's red blood cells that are in plasma. And plasma is essentially a fluid which contains water and lots of other things dissolved, which we'll talk about soon. And so we consider this a type of connective tissue. Other examples of this are like fat cells, bones are an example of connective tissue, and so forth. These are things that don't really fit into the other categories of tissue. So I'm sure you've heard of them in grade 10, but it's just to mention that we consider blood to be a type of connective tissue. So, the main components of our blood now, I was just mentioning there was the plasma, but our blood has a cellular component, which are made of cells, and platelets, which are cell parts, I'll mention soon. And then it has the sort of non cellular component, which we're also going to make mention of soon. So, the cellular component is red and white blood cells as well as platelets. The red blood cells, their whole main job is transport of O2 and CO2. So red blood cells are also called erythrocytes, and you'll see me short form it quite often as RBC, red blood cell, but they have a very specific shape. So it looks sort of like it bends in the middle. It looks almost like a peanut shape. We call this, the technical term is a biconcave disc or a biconcave shape. And the purpose of this shape is that it has a very high surface area to volume ratio. We've talked about before. Surface area means there's more locations for diffusion to occur. And so in this case, having a really high surface area blood cell is going to allow more diffusion, more efficient diffusion. This also has a very flexible shape. It can bend. In the center part, it's very flexible. And this allows it to fit into really tiny blood vessels called capillaries, which is what we find all around the body at our tissues. So that flexibility is going to allow them to move through in a single file line in those tiny vessels. In addition to that, our red blood cells also have a really important protein component, which is called hemoglobin. So hemoglobin, I've shown a little picture of it here. Its job is to bind oxygen in order for transport, as well as to transport CO2. So what this is essentially 4 different proteins that come together, which are called 4 heme groups, Heme, which is where we get hemoglobin. The 4 heme groups come together to make this larger hemoglobin. And you'll also notice that there's these little red ones in here called iron, and that's just iron atoms. And I was mentioning before in lesson number 2, iron is a really important mineral. It's a micronutrient. We don't need a whole ton of it. But iron is really, really important here because it actually helps to attract oxygen to the hemoglobin. So without enough iron here, you could end up with what's called iron deficient anemia. So this sort of has the symptom of things like fatigue. It could actually end up in some of your cells dying because they're not getting enough oxygen and so forth. So that's what we call anemia. Okay, that's the red blood cells not efficiently getting oxygen around the body. The second cellular component are the white blood cells. There are a ton of types. I've just put a picture here that has 5 examples. These are sort of like the 5 more common examples, but there are lots of types of white blood cells. I'm going to post a video up just for interest's sake there, which is all the kinds of connections in the immune system. There's like so much going on. I've taken an entire course in university just on the immune system cells because these are just a very limited list, but these are sort of the more common ones we talk about. The reason I've put it here is not to memorize it or even their functions right now. I just wanted to mention these are all very different from one another. So each of the immune system cells that you look at has a very different structure and a very different function. So I just put that to sort of show you that part. Again, white blood cells of the immune system, their job is to protect us from infections. So we know from Unit 1, they protect us, our vaccines are trying to help actually arm our immune system for that. They're also supported by things like antibiotics and so forth, so helping us to stay healthy. The third and final of these cellular components are platelets. And these are like little pieces of cell fragments, and they help with blood clotting. So they're no longer actively living cells. They're sort of like recycled pieces of cells, which help with sealing up any wounds that we have with blood clotting. Now, to that end, we also have what's called the extracellular component. This is everything else that is not a cellular component. So that includes the plasma, which is very watery. Within the plasmid, we have all this other stuff dissolved solutes. So examples of that are clotting factor, which I mentioned with hemophilia, that allows the platelets to actually come together and seal up a wound. So those are examples of proteins. You would have antibodies floating around in there. I put nutrients here because let's say that it had just picked up glucose from the small intestine, that's going to be dissolved in the plasma, and so on and so on. So this plasma component is actually super important as well. It's not only the red blood cells or only the cells, we also need the plasma because the plasma carries really important stuff from point A to point B, right? Circulatory system is all about transportation. So it's not only just moving red blood cells, it's also moving all of those other components. So the last thing in here that we're going to really talk about is the blood types. And we've talked about the blood types previously, specifically in our genetics unit. I actually showed you this exact same picture, but we really didn't go over it in much detail. So what I wanted to reinforce here, and I've posted a video for you to watch on YouTube as well, what is the importance of this ABO blood types idea? So as sort of a quick reminder, these are based on alleles that we have in our genome for the ABO types. And what it actually determines are the antigens on the surface of our blood cells. Now, each of us, depending on what our blood cell type is, we are also going to produce antibodies. And we are producing antibodies essentially against whatever we feel is non-self. So, myself as a type B person, I am producing antibodies against type A. So, essentially, if a type A blood was inserted into my body, I would actually start fighting an immune response against that. So just to kind of summarize that, we're essentially seeing other blood types as non-self. And so the body will enter essentially an immune response if that was tried to be added to our own bloodstream. So there is a really good video I've posted for you to watch on that. But just to kind of summarize it, in terms of blood donations, right, who can receive and who can give to who, it's very much dependent on what antibodies the person makes. So, as a type A person, I can donate to other people who are type A as well as type AB. But I can only receive from an O type person or an A type person. And I want to just reiterate up here why that is. So, if I look at a type O blood type, there's no antigens on the surface. Now, again, for simplicity's sake, I'm ignoring the positive and negatives right now. I'm just talking about the ABO types. Of course, adding in the rhesus factor of the plus and minus, that adds a whole other dimension to this, which we're not discussing now. But I can take blood from a type O person and give it to anyone because there's no antigens on the surface that are going to be rejected. Likewise, I can give any type of blood to a type AB person because they don't make any antibodies. Okay, so this little table is sort of summarizing what I've just said there. Again, we're thinking about it in terms of what antibodies does the person make? And if so, we wouldn't want to give them any blood type that's going to cause a reaction in their body. What essentially happens, and if you watch the video, it talks a little bit about this. These antibodies, if they come in contact, for example, an anti-B antibody comes in contact with a type B cell, it's going to actually bond onto the surface of that cell and cause a precipitation to happen. It's going to actually coagulate and start to solidify. And so, thinking about the whole circulatory system, if you have solidification happening somewhere in the body, that's going to cause blockages. And blockages are really, really bad in the circulatory system. We're going to go into some examples of that after, but especially if the blockage comes anywhere close to your heart, it could potentially stop blood flow to the heart cells, which causes a heart attack. Or likewise, if it happens near your brain and you stop getting oxygen to your brain, that's a stroke. So definitely important. Again, I would highly recommend that video that I posted for this, just to kind of see what the overall effect of these blood types are. But this is a really handy, just little summary of those things. I also mentioned here just other donations because that question comes up a lot as well. It's very possible to find donors for other things as well as blood, so things like stem cells, things like organs, and so forth. But as always, we need to make sure that the donor and recipient have matching antigens. Otherwise, we have rejections happening. And rejections is, again, your immune system's response to things that it perceives as threatening or things that it perceives as non-self. So just something to be aware of. The plasma donation, sometimes we use this to donate to people who lack certain substances. I used the example previously of hemophilia. In hemophilia A, the person oftentimes will lack a protein needed in their plasma that helps with blood clotting. So people who have hemophilia, they actually inject themselves daily or whatever the case might be, depending on the severity, with that clotting factor. So it's definitely possible to donate that. Stem cells, you might have heard of stem cell donation. Speaking specifically about bone marrow, because that's the type of adult stem cells that we have after our days as embryos. So when we're no longer embryos, we still have some stem cells in our bone marrow. We can actually extract those cells and use it to treat people with leukemia. Because you might know that those bone marrow stem cells are actually precursor cells to blood cells. And so people with leukemia have essentially misshapen or misformed white blood cells. And so if we treat them by putting someone else's stem cells there, they may be able to then produce the proper blood cells and sort of eliminate those ones that were causing the cancer. And last but not least on this list, just because it's sort of interesting, is just live organ donations. So, of course, many of you are starting to drive now. What you'll find in Ontario is that there's actually, with your driver's license, the option to sign up as a donor of organs. So, of course, we still have to be sure of things like compatibility. It can't be just any random organ to any random person, but we can have live donations as well. So, things like the kidneys, where we have two of them, it's very possible to transplant one kidney from a person to another person. So, just something to think about. It's not only donating blood, but there's a lot of other possibilities that come up with this topic.